Hi, my name's Gabe. I'm with Thinking Outside the Long Box podcast. I'll be moderating today. I have a few questions of my own, and then while I'm asking those, you guys can think up some questions for our panelists. What I prefer to do is actually let you guys go down the line and introduce yourselves so that you can say whatever it is that you're most proud of, or that, you know, why you feel you're here and that kind of stuff. So we can start at that and come back.
Hi, my name is Jeanty, comic artist. I've worked in the business a little over 25 years. I've worked for Marvel, DC, all of the major companies at some point. Probably my biggest claim to fame is working on Buffy the Vampire Slayer with Joss Whedon and then Serenity, a bunch of his properties. And I've also worked with a gentleman named John Ridley, who is a writer in Hollywood as well. And just an artist, and I keep going. So.
Hi, I'm Spike Trotman. Spike is fine. I am the founder, owner, and editrix for life at Iron Circus Comics. It is the largest comics publisher in Chicago for sure, probably the largest comics publisher in Illinois. In the Midwest, it gets kind of weird to quantify, but we are big. We put out 10 to 12 books a year. We have international distribution, and we celebrated 10 years in 2017. We were Kickstarter early adopters. We ran our first Kickstarter the year the site launched in 2009. We have since run 17 Kickstarter projects. We are 17 for 17 funded, and we made our millionth dollar on Kickstarter in 2007. So that's been really exciting. We were, if not the first, one of the first comics publishers to really utilize Kickstarter as part of the publishing process. And what we are doing is now being imitated by publishers all over, from Oni Press to Seven Seas to pretty much any other publisher you can think of. It's really exciting to be sort of on the bleeding edge of where the small press is going right now. Just last night, As the Crow Flies, our big book of the year, honestly, beat out 80 other titles, including titles from Scholastic, Dark Horse, and First Second, to win the Excellence in Graphic Literature Award for middle grade books. That's been super exciting. It also won the Stonewall Honor Award from the American Library Association and was recently added to the Amelia Bloomer list of feminist literature for young readers. And it's going to be at the American Library Association conference next week, where the author Melanie Gilman will be accepting the award in person. Other than that, we have also published a ton of pornography. There has been sort of a resurgence in woke porno in the small press that we are exclusively responsible for, with the Smut Peddler series of woman-made, consent-driven smut. And our very first Smut Peddler was, when I hit the launch button, people told me no one wanted it, it would never sell, women didn't like porn. It asked for $20,000 and it made $80,000. The second one asked for $20,000 and made $180,000. And the third one asked for $40,000 because it was for 2 books, and it made $160,000. So those are some of our best sellers, some of our most popular books at cons and online. And we scored Major League Distro, like I mentioned, from Consortium Books, which is a subdivision of Ingram. So now our books are in libraries all over the country and in bookstores all over the world, and things are just looking up from there. It's been a really good 10 years, and it's just sort of trending upwards, and I'm really excited to be responsible for this awesome publishing company that is sort of leading the way for a lot of other small press publishers and creators.
My name is Ron Wilson. I'm a Bronze Age artist. I worked for Marvel Comics in 1973 up until about 1993. I worked on the on Marvel 2-in-1, The Thing, The Incredible Hulk, which coincided with the Lou Ferrigno television show, Masters of the Universe, and many, many more. I think most known for WCW, where I got to meet all the wrestlers. My best friend was Johnny B. Bad. We got free tickets to all the fights. Actually, there were more fights in the stands than were in the ring. And believe me, those guys were huge. I don't know if steroids was big at that time, but I wouldn't want to have an encounter with either one of those guys in a dark alley. Mm-hmm. So it's been a very good ride for me at Marvel. I'm doing independent work. I'm doing Super Boxers. The first book was launched in 1983, and I'm presently doing Super Boxers #2. And I do own the rights, and we do have some movie producers banging on my door to take a look at the project, and hopefully I can get that project on the silver screen. So that's my love, my passion, and my dream at this particular point in my life.
My name is Greg Neri. I write for young people novels and poetry and picture books. I also have 2 graphic novels. My first one, Yummy, kind of changed the model in terms of how we sell these books. And so I always feel like I'm different than most of the other comic sellers here. We sell directly to schools and libraries, and this book has been selling steadily for 8 years and just keeps going and going and going. And I'm told it's the most stolen book in the school library systems around the country, which is a good thing, I guess, because they have to keep reordering it, so that's part of the sales model. And I just keep going. I have a new one called Grand Theft Horse, which is coming out in a couple months, but that's it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jose Pimienta. I go by Joe. I was raised in Mexicali, which is a border city with Mexico and the U.S. Currently, I live in Glendale, California, where I do work on both comics and doing storyboarding for live action and for animation. Some of the bigger projects that I've been involved in is it's predominantly on the comic side. I worked with Van Jensen on this book called The Leg that was nominated for the Eisner Award for Best Coloring, and then I worked with Cecil Castellucci on this book called Soupy Leaves Home, which is a great book. And currently, I'm also working on a couple of books on my own, and glad to be here.
Awesome. So today is about diverse comic creators and how the industry is changing. So basically the state of comics obviously is changing for a lot of people. Like the fanboy culture is kind of slowly going the way of the buffalo. It's not really...
I want to talk about that.
Oh, I know you do. I can tell. But what I would really like to ask first off is, how has the industry changed in your eyes since you started as a comic creator?
I got into comics when comics was going to die. I got into comics in the 90s, and this was when the black and white boom became the black and white bust. In case you're not familiar, the black and white boom was when these 2 guys, I don't know, maybe you've heard of them, Eastman and Laird, they put out a silly, dumb little comic about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And it exploded with like Tsar Bomba force, and it became what it is today. And everybody wanted the next Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and everybody wanted to find the next Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So the comic market was flooded with crazy black and white books, really off-the-wall titles that didn't have a ton of sincerity to them. And as a result, comic shops were really weighed down with all these unsellable books that no one was interested in. So they had put all these money into these black and white independents that they were not moving. And then Marvel Comics declared bankruptcy. And when you declare bankruptcy, that basically means your debtors don't get what you owe them. And a lot of people suffered under the combination of the black and white bust and large companies declaring bankruptcy or going under. There used to be multiple comic distros. They got whittled down to 1, Diamond. 1/3 of comic shops in the United States went under, like a full third, 1 in 3. And a lot of people, when I decided this is what I wanted to do with my life, were talking about how comics would not last. Like, as an industry, comics would not last another 10 years because they had spent the last several decades painting themselves into a corner where they were appealing to a narrower and narrower demographic of readers. And it sort of became this Ouroboros, this inescapable cycle where, well, we can only sell superhero books to white, straight, cis men between the ages of 25 and 45, because those are the only people who come in the comic shop. And if we ever try to make anything else, those people don't know that comic exists, so it doesn't sell. So therefore, we can only make these superhero books. And the people who are interested in superhero books have been trending downwards since the 70s. Oh my God, what do? We're all going to die, ha ha ha, dumpster fire. And these were the editors I was trying to get past when I decided to make my crazy comics. But it was at this time that this thing called the internet came around, and the internet didn't have an editor, and the internet didn't have somebody who had to worry, but can I sell this to a white, straight, cis male between the ages of 25 and 45? And so I was part of sort of like the ground floor of the webcomics thing. And that was fun. It was very difficult to make a living then. It was pre-Patreon, pre-Drip, pre-Kickstarter, and we were still figuring things out. And it taught me a lot, and I kind of labored in the webcomic mines for 10 years. And then sort of Kickstarter came along and supercharged everything. So that was like my burning on entry into comics, where I decided this awesome industry that is dying before my eyes, I got to get a piece of that.
Well, I came out of the children's literature side, and at that time when I started, none of the big publishers were really doing comics except for a few, but the Penguins and the Random Houses and Macmillans didn't have any comic divisions or anything like that. So not only was this my first graphic novel, it was the first graphic novel for this publisher, but then it became like their best-selling book, and then, now every single major publisher has their own comics division, so now it's a whole other thing. Although I always feel like it's not part of the con world still. It's like a whole separate thing still.
Totally.
It's still being sold like they sell their other books, but it's slowly crossing over. Like you don't see those publishers here. Like my publisher is here, but no one else is here.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting. I feel like an outsider here, and but I like being around other comic artists and writers. So.
Yeah, as a creator who has gone from sort of indie comics land and being jumped into like the prose publishing model, where when a book is finished, it doesn't come out for between 8 and 10 months, and you need the publicist, and you need the star reviews in the journals, and you need the blurbs, you need this, that, the other. It's been a real eye opener.
Yeah.
Well, I was part of the great implosion at Marvel, and there were a lot of titles that saturated the market. And so I guess that's a way of reorganization. You mentioned bankruptcy.
Yeah.
A lot of the companies were filing that. So to me, that's reorganization. and downsides, unfortunately, I was part of the ones that walked the plank along with a lot of artists, that also were looking for work. So I looked for work elsewhere and went outside the comic book industry and sort of worked my way back in maybe 20 years later. And so I said, what, I'm working on my own stuff because I'd rather own my titles, own the copyright, and maybe when not too long from now, sitting back in my rocking chair, I can collect my own royalty checks. You know what I'm saying? So that's the work for hire is good because it does pay the bills. And I worked on the thing for about 14 years. And I think I have drawn about 1 million rocks since then. But they did pay the bills. So when I got tired, they threw me on He-Man. And fortunately and unfortunately, I was sorry I left the thing because He-Man took a ton of reference. Mattel Toys wanted it done a certain way. You had to know the villains, know the heroes, know all the characters inside out, which was good because it did hone my skills. So when the WCW came along and I had to learn all the wrestlers, all the nuances, the faces, the quirks of the wrestlers and the storylines, that was great. So it just prepared me as an artist to tackle, I call them odd jobs. So I got all the tough work. So that's how I stayed employed. And I filled that niche. And that was the thing.
I think it's very telling, just want to interject a little bit. I think it's very telling that even creators, like big deal creators who directed Marvel movies and whatever, when they're done doing that, then they suddenly want to do creator owned. Because at the end of the day, IP is quite frankly turning out to be the most valuable thing. There's who in the world would have thought there would have been a Rocket Raccoon movie? Who would have thought, hey, that character everyone makes fun of, the dumbest Todd McFarlane character ever? He's not going to get one movie. He's going to get 2 movies, and everyone's going to love him. And just owning the character, you honestly cannot predict what'll blow up. From the webcomics world, Kate Beaton made comics about Napoleon, and she became a New York Times bestselling author on the back of comics about Napoleon. And it's all about owning your own work.
Yes.
Well, no, I was just going to say that I know that we're talking about comics, but it's also interesting to hear that also expands to other areas of entertainment and just like I'm familiar with a couple of people that work in animation, and they say the same thing, and they're storyboarding for big companies and doing amazing work, storyboarding and what have you. But even they also say, I kind of want to try and do my own thing. I want to see if I can raise funding to do either my own short film, or maybe I want to go back to drawing comics and just go back to that. And I think it ties into what you're saying is like eventually they come to the realization that your own IP or just being able to navigate your own creation, for that matter, is really what is invaluable.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to see that we're at a point where that's becoming such a tendency.
There's definitely, like, the big companies have money. I've seen the page rates for Marvel and DC and whatever. Once you become an established artist there, yeah, you're paying your mortgage and sending your kids to college, no problem. But at the end of the day, unless you have negotiated a really good contract, that page rate is where the buck stops. So.
But in terms of change, in terms of like schools and libraries, 10 years ago, graphic novels were not a real big feature in schools and libraries, and now it's like huge.
Oh my God, yes.
And in terms of diversity, like the titles I do, they really crave them, and so because not a lot of people are doing comics with kids of color in them that they know of, and so when it comes along, they really grab it.
Yeah. My distro begs me for middle grade and young reader books that are graphic novels. They're like everything. What Scholastic has sort of primed everything that now these little kids are voraciously reading graphic novels. They're reading Amulet, and they're reading Witch Boy, and they're reading all this other stuff they bought at the book fair. And now it's like, what else you got? And I mean, this year I'm putting out end of this year, I'm putting out a collection of themed fairy tales that are from Africa. And when I told them about that, you could hear them jumping up and down at the other end of the phone, because it's like so many readers of comics these days are in, late elementary, middle school, and then early middle school. And that's who the market, like, they're hungry. And that's awesome to see.
I think, jump in.
This has gone so long, I forgot what the question was.
We're just kind of doing our own thing now.
I did too. I was just listening. How do you feel the industry has changed since you started in the industry?
I hate to differ with you, but I started in the early 90s, and comics were doing great.
Really?
Everything was, at least when at mine, I actually managed a shop before I started doing
Because 96 is when Marvel declared bankruptcy.
well, they've done it a couple times.
But that was like the 90s time. So.
Yeah, and that was more from Image, all that divesting from the Magnificent Seven, as they like to call themselves. But a lot of great creators went and created their own comic company called Image Comics.
Because they realized creator-owned was the way to go.
Yeah, and that left Marvel in a bit of a rut, but they still had the characters. They could leave, but they couldn't take Spider-Man or any other of those characters.
Yeah.
So I started then, and it was very different because there were a lot more independents. Yeah, and there were a lot more shops too, but in all fairness, a lot of shops went into business in the early 90s, basically because of that boom, and subsequently closed because of the implosion.
Yeah, and
whittled it down to just the shops that were there primarily from the 70s
Yeah,
or
I mean,
80s.
theoretically, yeah, but a lot of the thing I didn't cover that also happened in the 90s, maybe some of you remember it, maybe you don't, is there was this very weird sort of comics as investment thing, and you'd see a lot of stuff on the news about, oh, I bought this copy of Action Comics #1 and totally forgot about it in my childhood bedroom. And I'm 60, and I went and I cleaned my childhood bedroom, and I found this copy of Action Comics #1, and I sold it at Sotheby's for $1 million. And people were like, oh. And then they'd be like, oh, and Detective Comics, the first appearance of Batman, I sold that for $600,000. And there was a news clip that you can probably still find on YouTube back when DC killed Superman, of a line outside a shop, and there was a woman, and she was holding Death of Superman, the issue, and then she was holding a copy of Reign of the Supermen, which was when all the different not Supermen showed up. And she held this one, this is going to send my kid to college, and this is going to send my kid to medical school. And it was kind of like, oh, sweetie. And when this thing didn't come true, when this sort of fantasy of comics as a layman's stock market did not pan out, that hurt comic shops a lot too. That was also, like, there were multiple factors in sort of a third of comic shops closing and all but one distro going out of business and a whole lot of publishers just sort of going up in smoke, and that was just one of them. But.
Yeah, well, the Death of Superman was a book that sold millions and
for
millions
sure.
of copies, and the whole point
Because
of
it was
something-
collectible.
The whole thing of something being valuable is that because there's not too many copies of that. So
Yeah.
anybody buying something.
Exactly. It's like if and Spawn #1 did the same thing. Because,
Well, all of the Image books, yeah.
Well, but the thing about Spawn #1 is people at this point were primed to be, collectors for investments, and Spawn had every sweet spot. It had, hot shit artists. It had new character. It had #1 book. So those are like the three things that just like Action Comics #1, and people were buying them, and it was eventually the print run hit literally 2 million or something, and it's like there's nothing where there's 2 million of them that's ever going to be all that valuable, but people are bagging and boarding them 10 at a time.
The only thing that I'll also add to that, and just because, the only thing that I'll also add to that is also just kind of like where we are right now, where, but yeah, there was a time where comics were also just being viewed as specifically just entertainment, and also right now, even though we've all kind of been using it, I'm not going to take a guess that we all learned reading comics and what have you. But because of going back to what we're saying, that because a lot of libraries are starting to pick them up and they're starting to see the value of how to use comics as an educational tool as well, which is something that we all kind of knew, I guess, in a sense of comics are great for what have you. But now that the industry, in a sense, is starting to pick up on that and starting to use it and trying to put it in the classroom and try to use it as a foundation for cultural widening and more and becoming and starting to let all these stories of different diversities start getting to be more known and what have you. It is an interesting change that is happening, and I, for one, can help to be there for there to be more recognition of it.
Yeah.
So.
A word that comes up a lot with my distro is reluctant readers. The sales force for my distro actually has a flyer they hand out to librarians at ALA events, American Library Association events. That is literally a comic, and it just says, "Why should my library stock graphic novels?" And it has a comic that's done. It's well, they're great for reluctant readers, kids who maybe think they don't like reading or find reading difficult, love graphic novels. And another one is, there are 76 volumes of Naruto, and no parent is going to buy their child 76 volumes of Naruto. But if the library has 76 volumes of Naruto, guess who's getting a library card? And so libraries are sort of understanding now the value of the graphic novel. A lot of the times it's very kid-focused, but there are people who are very gung-ho about developing the adult collection too, and they want, the hunting accident, and they want all these other comics for adults and young
they do have
adults.
adult graphic novel sections now, so now they're separated even. So you have middle grade graphic novels, YA graphic novels, adult.
Yeah,
Right.
and that's nice.
It's amazing because at my personal library that I go to the most, they're not separated, and I've literally watched somebody a 9-year-old pull black holes off the shelf. I'm like, wow, that's going to get weird later.
Yeah. It's sort of reminiscent of when I was a child, and my parents rented Ralph Bakshi's Wizards for me because it was a cartoon.
Yeah.
It was a cartoon.
It's an education. That's a different kind of education.
And also, one of the things that I learned with working with Cecil in this book is just because Cecil has the history of working with YA novels and stuff. I had never heard of the idea of something called a teacher's guide, and that's something that she had to put together for Soupy Leaves Home, to just put a teacher's guide in order to make a good, I guess, advertisement in a way of how to tell teachers this is a book that could be very educational for your students,
tie it into the
curriculum. Tie it into the curriculum. So, and I don't think that's something that you would have found a few years ago.
The prose scene is keeping a lot of delicious secrets from comics. And I used to, 2 or 3 years ago, I used to sit there and wonder, how the heck did that guy get a review on Forbes? How the heck did that comic get a review in Rolling Stone? How the heck? And it's now I know. It's there are databases of people, and there are, people whose entire job it is to get your comic that review there. And that's why you go with this distro, because that's, when you're working in comics, you're very used to Diamond, and you're very used to, especially if you're a small publisher or an independent publisher, basically being ignored by Diamond or given the absolute minimum of interface by Diamond. But when you have and I'm going to say it, if you have a real distributor, there is a workforce there for you. And that was something, it took me a year to get used to that, a year to get used to emails from people going, hello, I noticed you're publishing this book about XYZ. Here's a list of awards to submit it to. And by the way, we have our guy, he's about to go on the road in the Midwest, and I see this book is set in the Midwest, so you should send him 50 copies. Oh, and by the way, if you want to organize a book tour for your creator, this, and this are open, and here's how you go about it. And I was like, get off my neck. Like, what's going on here? Why are you always emailing? Am I doing something wrong? And it's like, no, this is what a distributor is supposed to do.
Yeah. And for these, we take the middle row, which is not Diamond and not the children's lit distributors either, but going directly to schools and library and developing our own network, and that's been paid off really nicely in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
Another question?
Yeah, let's go.
We love that one.
This is fun.
So I'm actually going to scrap these questions because I have a question more towards like the scholastic and the educational side. I know so my grandfather and my uncle were both illiterate until they were adults. My uncle was taught how to read by my cousin. She taught him with the local newspaper, and my grandpa taught himself how to read using comic books. Like he would basically equate the words and the pictures and put it all together, and eventually he learned how to read English that way. How do you feel like, especially for Ron and, I'm going to mispronounce your name, I'm sorry. Yeah, is it Georges?
Georges, yeah.
Georges, okay, sorry. I'm so bad with saying names right, I'm really sorry. But with the two of you, you've done more of like the kind of pop, like you with Buffy and Serenity and you with The Thing and Marvel 2-in-1 and stuff. They're more of like the kind of pop culture-y comics as opposed to being in the educational system. My grandpa taught himself how to read on Marvel books. Like, how do you guys feel that your books fit in as like a component of that educational piece?
Well, I get that all the time at conventions. And he's an adult now. He was born with an immune system problem. And he's born in a bubble. So they stuck a Marvel 2-in-1 book in there, and that taught him how to read. So just to piggyback on what you were saying, I'm glad the educational system has finally caught up with comic books and literacy. Because like I said, we've been at work. And that's how you get all different types of kids. Problem kids, kids that are good readers, kids from dysfunctional homes. And they pick up a comic book first before they pick up anything else. So I get stories like that. They say, because of you, I was exposed to reading and to want to read more based on comic books and through comic books.
Yeah, most of the stuff I've done really is just for purely entertainment purposes. There's no, you could always say there's a hidden message somewhere. The only thing probably that had a message that I did was working with John Ridley, and he had done a book where it's with the first black superhero in the 60s. And Kennedy is now introducing this sanctioned superhero group, of which there is one black character that nobody knows because his face is covered, because, of course, in the early 60s, that wouldn't have flown with a lot of white America. But in doing so, he really just set out to entertain. The fact that he mentions the Black Panther or the Freedom Ride movement or any of those other subtle things within that area was more of an eventuality. He was really set out to do something to entertain. So nothing I've really done, and most of the Buffy stuff, while I'm so proud of it, it's about vampires and witches and things like that. So there really isn't anything there aside from having a gay character and treating all of that in a very respectful way. I don't think I've done necessarily anything that goes beyond the entertainment factor, really.
Yeah.
So for me, like I often wonder, like, because entertainment is such a huge part of like what we take in and how we learn, like I would never discount what you're saying, like having a gay character in a book that's treated with respect is a learning for my kids when they read Buffy or when they read Serenity, like, because that exposes them to this type of person, and we treat them exactly the same way as we treat whoever.
Normalizing
like that's
it.
That's a super important.
Yeah, and that's great. Unfortunately, a lot of what I've done that's secondary, not primary.
Yeah, well, in my opinion, it doesn't have to be primary. It doesn't have to be front and center. Look, he's gay, and we get to sit at the same table. It's like just having one of my big problems with a lot of sort of attempts at inclusivity in comics is when here's the character that's not white, that's not a man, that's not cis, that's not straight, whatever, and their entire story revolves around them not being white, straight, cis, male, whatever. Like the black character, every storyline is about how they're black. The gay character, every storyline is about how they're gay. Instead of, here's the gay character, and today his storyline is how he fell in a ravine, and the sun's about to rise, and he's a vampire, and he can't get out, and he's gonna die because sunlight, Like, normalizing them so that literally what makes them not isn't the primacy of their existence. Like, I walk around every day and my mind is not occupied about how I'm not a man. You know what I mean? It's like there's a lot more to me, and most of my concerns have nothing to do with how I'm not a white man. And
there's probably more men that are concerned about the fact that they're not a man.
Yeah, honestly. And it's like that's really refreshing to me. That's really cool for me when I see storylines that just have characters like that, and their storyline is about there's a meteor streaking towards Earth and we're all going to die unless,
Right. Yeah, part of it too is, doing characters that kids can see themselves in as, visually, but then for everybody else who's not like that character to allow them to walk in that character's footsteps so they see that they are just like them, and it's cool. Like just walking around today or yesterday, it's cool to see little white kids dressed up as Black Panther, whatever,
Yeah.
And it's not like a big thing. That's their superhero they love. So.
And to a lesser degree, there's been a lot of sort of rhetoric and talk right now in a lot of sort of third-wave feminist circles about how when little girls idolize male characters, like if a little girl really loves Superman or something, everyone's like, oh, that's cool, that's cute. But if a little boy says his favorite hero is She-Ra, a lot of people feel the need to correct him. And right now there's a lot of talk about how if you have a boy child and you tell him that women aren't worthy of admiration and idolization, that's sort of a seed that you're planting when you're talking about how, if women are unworthy of your idolization, it's a very short jump to women are not worthy of your respect and women are not worthy of equality. And so it's really nice. I saw a little boy in an Elsa dress.
There's a lot of cross-gender dressing.
Yeah,
this
crossplay,
time.
yeah. And I was like, oh, that's cool. He likes Elsa, bless him.
Just to plug in like an anecdote for myself on this one, and just like to piggyback on what you're saying there, it's also I think it was a couple of years ago when I read this book called This One Summer. Now, if anybody has not read this book, I highly recommend it. It's great, and it's about these two girls going away to this beach place for a summer, and it's just about that. And that book, as you can tell, I'm not a girl. But that book really resonated with me because of what's going on in that story and how it's about like things that are happening in the family and things that are just about this family getting away from their daily lives into this beach town. So I guess what I'm getting with that is just like, you never know what's really going to resonate, but the more you're exposed to those kinds of things, you would surprise yourself of like what other ways you can identify as.
Yeah.
So when it comes to creating like diverse comics, and not even necessarily culturally diverse, racially diverse, gender or sexuality diverse, but just in general, like getting out of the bubble of superhero books and licensed titles and things like that, in any fashion, what do you think is the biggest struggle the industry faces in just any kind of diversity?
Sort of, a lot of people have the mindset, and they need to be sort of divorced, or they need to be educated out of this mindset that if I make a comic and in that comic there's a black character and there's like a Chinese character and there's a gay character or whatever, and they're part of this ensemble cast, there's this urge like, oh, you're forcing diversity. And, that's cute, but no, you're just so accustomed to artificially enforced homogenous casts, like that literally do not reflect reality, that now when introduced with something that literally more accurately reflects reality than what you're used to, you're reacting to it as if it's artificial. when you walk out the door and you see these people, but somehow if they appear in your fiction, you don't know how to deal with it. It's not forced diversity, it's the removal of artificial homogeneity, whatever it is. And
Homogenization, I believe it is.
thank you. But like
I was trying
understanding that like these characters that a lot of folks, especially like superhero type folks, are so married to, they're from the 50s, you know? And so when they're just white across the board, yes, they're from the 50s. And a certain kind of thing was plausible as a sellable item and was acceptable to put on a newsstand in the 50s. That also didn't reflect reality, by the way, but like that, those are based on 50s ethics and 50s codes. And so when, I'm sorry, I don't read superhero comics, so forgive me here. If like Iron Man is a black woman now, okay, you're having a seizure about it because you are literally so used to the artificiality of, what is it now, 70-year-old characters. And why are you so married to a 70-year-old, even artificial then view of the world? Like that's something people don't interrogate. It's like, you can't change it. Actually, we can. People change stories all the time.
And sometimes it's just a simple visual thing, like 8 years ago, just having a black boy on the front cover. A lot of the major publishers were doing books with people of color as the main characters, but the actual cover, you would see the character, but they would be in shadow.
Or Octavia
sometimes
Butler
they would even
books.
make them whitish, and it was like a big thing. But that's gotten better. But sometimes a simple thing like that is a powerful thing, just representing the truth of the story that you're doing, for a publisher to like say, okay, up front and center, black character right there, not a big deal. It's just a person. So.
If you look at Octavia Butler books from the 70s, the covers are like, who is that? Because she's not in the story.
Exactly. Sometimes they'll make people up and just drop them in.
But I'm actually really sort of encouraged these days because a lot of people look at the cover of a book, As the Crow Flies, the big book we've had this year. It has a black queer girl on the cover. And I've had very few reactions like, oh, I guess this isn't for me. It's just like people going, oh, I've never read a story like that. I'll take one. And, that is actually a tidal shift in the way these kinds of stories and book covers used to be approached. Like that black was niche, queer was niche, anything that was not white and male and cis was niche. It was for those people only. Whereas now people are sort of more willing to understand that, stories are for everyone and this is about a viewpoint I'm possibly not that, sort of educated about or, and I'm curious and I want to see.
Okay.
Okay.
I was going to say, we have this phrase in Spanish. I don't know if it exists in American English, but it goes like, taste is in diversity, or it alludes to the more you expose yourself to different things, the better you will, the more you will, you'll be able to grow in that sense. And I mean, and just repeating what I said earlier, it's the more you read and the more you diversify even your own catalog of literature, you will be surprised of what you're able to relate to, even if it's not on a superficial level of what you think is relatable to you.
And also, that's true for the publishers in terms of the old school versus the new school. In the libraries, you had a lot of older librarians, and now there's a whole school of younger librarians.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine told me the story from a while back, but he had a book with a queer character and a black character, and he was invited to give a talk, and then they rescinded it because the excuse was, well, we don't really serve that community. And he looked, and they had, of course, all the Harry Potter books, and his reaction was, so I guess you have a lot of wizards here?
Yeah.
Did anybody have any questions that they were thinking of?
Anything. Hey.
So I know that you said you're from Mexicali, right on the border. I don't know, because I didn't grow up in that area, but is there a different culture from Mexico, towards comic books, and if so, how has that changed?
That's a very good question. Yeah, there is a bit of a difference between the border culture versus the rest of the interior of the country. Then that's a whole different conversation we can have some other time. As far as comics appreciation, I'm very happy to see that it is growing, because for the longest time, and even while I was growing up, I had a hard time getting into comics because the variety was so limited, and now that I'm starting to see like different graphic novels on different shelves of different subject matter, I can see that there are being more attempts made to actually diversify and to grow that variety, which I think is great.
Yeah.
But it's still going. It's still slow. Still, the majority of people that are interested in comics in I don't know if all of Mexico, but I specifically in my hometown, is still predominantly geared towards the big two and things that fall within those lines. But yet every time that I talk to other artists or I talk to other cartoonists from my hometown and I just tell them about this one book, they're like, oh, that's great. We're going to get more of that stuff. So it's up and growing. So like it's
Also, like internationally, it has been even more behind than the States in terms of like these kinds of stories. And so for a long time, it was like, oh, are you going to take this to the international fairs? It's like, no, they're not going to buy those books. And it was the same with movies, too. They're not going to buy movies with Will Smith or whatever, simple things like that. But that's changing, just like the movies have changed in the last 5 years in terms of black and brown actors, and those movies being picked up abroad more.
Black Panther
books
exploding.
Too, yeah.
Oh.
So I guess we're going to get kind of close to wrapping up, and I guess what is like the one book that each of you would recommend to say, hey, this is like my favorite thing that kind of represents like what I would love the future of comics to look like?
just one.
Yeah, just one's tough, honestly.
I know. Let's try to do like just your most favorite right this moment, because if we go too long, I get yelled at.
I think it's more about preference, whatever you get into. If you like
that's what I mean, like
or
your
relationships.
preference. Like, what's the book that you would love to see more like that? In the future?
Well, I love superhero books. I've always loved, and Ron, I'm a big fan of yours. I have every issue of 2-in-1 and The
great.
Thing and all those other special things you used to do. But I love the superhero genre, and when it's done right, it can be accepted just like any other genre. But in terms of comics, I feel that really change things. There's something called Love and Rockets that came out in the early 80s, and it's essentially about two girls who, well, one's gay, but the other one, at best, she's bisexual because they do get together, but then they go off and have other relationships.
Maggie and Hopi.
And it's not necessarily about that at all, but it's who they are and that's their life. And really their life is about these two. Well, one's Mexican and the other's, I think, Venezuelan or Colombian. I can't remember. And they live in California. And it's just the subtle day-to-day how life is in your particular town. And you can relate to that because they're very human characters. Yeah. And again, when superheroes are written well, I think you're associating more with the humanism of what they are rather than the superheroism of what they are. So I'd recommend highly Love and Rockets to anybody who hasn't read it yet.
For my part, I'm like, there's a big list of publishers on the internet, like the great big infographic of Comics Publishers 2018, and Iron Circus is listed as art house, and that is the most appropriate thing I've ever heard in my whole life. I like avant-garde kind of comics. I like out there and strange comics. I like political comics. I like comics that are quiet and strange. I would love to see more comics along the lines of what Emily Carroll has done. Emily Carroll is a cartoonist who busted out hardcore a few years ago with a webcomic. If you've never read it, please go read it, called His Face All Red. And it's a horror comic, and it is like chef kiss. It's a masterpiece. There's another comic, it's Japanese, called The Girl from the Other Side. It's a real strange one. It's very Japanese. It's about a little girl and her caretaker, who is clearly some manner of corrupted demon thing. He's not even, like, he can't even touch her. Touching her is dangerous. But he takes care of this little girl who doesn't see him as anything other than sensei, teacher, just this nice man who takes care of her, when his head is like this black blur with horns. It's fantastic and strange, and I love it. I would say that Michael DeForge is honestly one of my favorite cartoonists right now, too. Michael DeForge is a Canadian cartoonist. He works a lot in storyboarding as well. But he publishes through Koyama Press, and he put out a one-person anthology a few years ago that I go back and reread all the time. That's called Very Casual. And it's just so sublime. It's so weird. I love it. It's so... And just following him on Twitter, he does like these experimental comics. He's a weird dude, and I love it.
Well, I guess my comment would be based upon the era of comic books and publication. Because, I grew up on peanut butter and jelly, a glass of milk, and comic books that forged more on black and white morality, Flash versus Superman in a race. Very cute stories like that. And I grew up on that. But I'll be a hypocrite to tell you that I'm part of the Bronze Age, where comic books cater more to adult stories, more edgy characters like Hellboy, dark characters. And we're a part of that, and we were responsible for the revolution that kickstarted comic books that catered to more toward an adult audience. So I like both, good and bad.
Well, I also love Love and Rockets and all the Hernandez brother books. And it's a great model, and then the fact that they have been doing it for so long is kind of crazy. But I just love that there's so many great... I mean, I'm a big fan of like personal stories and memoirs, comic memoirs and things like that. And I'm happy to see a lot of people from just different kinds of communities telling their own stories. There's so many I can't even pull them out of my head at the moment, but just more of that, and more that can cross over, and that adults will love, but also teens will love, and it's not like written specifically for teens, but it's kind of like stories everybody can get into. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I forgot one just real quick. There's a comic out right now, very easy to Google. Please go buy it and read it, especially if you love diary comics and memoirs. It's called My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness. It's by a Japanese creator. She is a woman who has reached her late 20s, who has never had an intimate relationship with anyone. She has some serious emotional issues. She pulls her own hair out. She still lives at home. She can't keep a job, goes on crying jags, serious depressive moments. And it talks about how she has this craving to be close to someone, anyone, and ends up hiring a female escort. And this is just sort of about her attempt to get some sort of connection with another human being, and the way she decides to do it, because her mom, her dad, her grandma, they're all emotionally totally unavailable, and she is not in a place where she can even venture a romantic relationship with someone. She hires an escort, and it's really good, and it's called My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness.
And then let's get Joe's. We
Yeah,
got like
sorry,
1
Joe.
minute left.
I want to plug in so many people and so many books on this, especially like all of our books. Just remember that we are creators, so all of our books, check us out. I also want to plug in a lot of friends, like anything by Meredith McLaren, Kel McDonald, Nate Powell, like it's so many more. But if I'm going to have to just say one book for right now, I'll go with the one that I just read last week, which is The Prince and the Dressmaker.
I want to read that.
It's an amazing book. Check it out. Again, ignore what anyone's telling you. Just go read that book because it'll play so strong. It's such an amazing book. So that's the one I'll plug in.
That's on my to-read list.
I can only pick one.
Let's give our panel a hand before I get yelled at. So.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm at table R1. I'm on an end cap. Please come check out my books, including the